thank you for your timekeeping, and it's late in the afternoon, but please take another hour, get yourself another hour and a half of enthusiasm to listen to our next speaker this afternoon, Teran Synge. He will share with us his experience and insights of the osteopathy he has lived, especially with a special focus and emphasis of an early osteopathic pioneer in England and in Ireland, Jocelyn Proby. Thank you, Teran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Gail, for inviting me, especially with such distinguished company and lecturers. I'm going to do two things, really. Three things. A bit of history, tiny bit of gossip in the middle, and I think the number is going up 4, actually. I'm going to then perhaps shock some people and horrify others. So I hope you can bear that. Are you flagging? Are you managing all that? I don't know how long this will take. It might be quite quick, you see, and then you can go off to supper early. Many of us have had the privilege of maybe one good teacher in one's life who inspired us, who we might have recognized at the time or realized later how much an influence they had on us. And this guy was that man for me, osteopathically anyway. Very little is known about his private life and so on, and perhaps some of you in the Institute of Classical Osteopathy know more than I do. I've noticed little notes that you have in some books. I recently went to see Jocelyn's son, who is a lovely chap, and he said, "Oh, Daddy didn't talk about his life very much." And I got surprisingly little, but I did glean some pictures from him, which I took on my camera, and these are here for us to see. He was born on the 3rd of March, 1900, so he was as old as a century. So whatever year it was, you knew what his age was. His father was a professional soldier. He was a colonel, I believe. His uncle was the Earl of Carrisford, and they were a big landowning family in the Northamptonshire and also in Ireland. They had a big estate, and they have a big place called Elton in Northamptonshire near Peterborough, a grand house full of wonderful pictures, Gainsboroughs and Rembrandts and so on. A big aristocratic family, and they had a big estate in Ireland which is gone. Somebody was talking about cholera. Jason was talking about cholera earlier. And there was a cholera epidemic in Ireland in the 19th century, so I forget the dates, but the Lord and Lady Carrisford of the time were wonderful because they rolled up their sleeves and went down and nursed all the people of the town of Arklow through their cholera. It was heroic, really, and the local priest did a most wonderful illuminated manuscript piece of gratitude, expression of gratitude for what they'd done. They were great people. They were the good, you often hear about absentee landlords in Ireland who had a bad name, but these were very hands-on people who were marvelous. Jocelyn himself spent his time in his boyhood between England and Ireland. He went to Eton as his school, and then he went to Magdalen College in Oxford, and he was a great scholar. He was a literary man, he was a musician. He rowed in the college rowing team. He was called to the bar, the English bar, as a barrister, but didn't practice, somewhat to the disappointment of his family, I think. He was very interested in history, Charles I, and into the Commonwealth with Cromwell, and afterwards was his specialist period. And he was very interesting to talk to about that, and was highly thought of as a scholar of that period. And in that particular direction of his career, he moved to the University of Toronto in Canada and was teaching English history on the staff of the University of Toronto alongside as it happens, a man called Lester B. Pearson, who became Prime Minister of Canada after that. And at some time at this stage, he met and married Lisa Carr. In 1930, he married her, actually, and she was a lovely woman. I knew her for a while when I was young. And these are pictures I've just recently, I'd never seen these before, I just discovered them about last week. And this, I'm not sure the order of them, but it's just, that's Jocelyn looking relaxed, perhaps at Oxford, perhaps in Canada, I don't know, or perhaps at Kirksville. That is a more formal picture of him, which you may have seen in his old Etonian tie. He had this wonderful watch on a fob chain, a gold watch, which he used to take out and look at whenever he wanted. He never had a wristwatch, he always had that. At some time around this time, he met a man called Mackinnon. And that's how he got interested in the Mackinnon approach and in Linlar. And he co-wrote, or ghost-wrote, a book with Mackinnon called The Conquest of Pain. Now, he was terribly modest, Jocelyn, but he did say that, he did once tell me that he really wrote the whole book because although Mackinnon was his inspiration, he really was almost illiterate. And so he wrote the book himself, but gave all the credit to Mackinnon, because that was a wonderful thing about Jocelyn. He mixed with a lot of people who would not be of the status quo acceptable, but yet they had something which fascinated him, and the fact that he was a different class or academic background or so on didn't worry him. He took them on an equal basis and learnt from them, sat at their feet and learnt, and that was one of the greatnesses of his personality, really, that he did that. Now, I think we have another slide here which might be appropriate. Yes, this is the certificate he got from Mackinnon. And that was, I see, 1941, so I'm a bit, obviously that was after Kirksville. I don't know much about his days at Kirksville, but there's a lot of stuff available in yearbooks and Kirksville stuff, and I'm sure Jason will show you a lot of stuff or can find it for you. One thing I have in my possession is a copy of a student newspaper of 1933, and on the front page there's a headline saying Jocelyn Campbell Patrick Proby founds British Empire Society, which is quite interesting. I think George III mustn't have been dead long in the minds of Americans at that time. Or maybe it's for a particular clique of English people who were there. He told me that after hours or after lectures at Kirksville, he used to seek out older lecturers and older members who were undoubtedly students or colleagues or contemporaries of Still. So, in a sense, I can claim a sort of apostolic succession. Now, he went back to Mackinnon. I think Mackinnon told him to go away and study. And then when he came back to Mackinnon, he said, now go away and practice for 2 years, and then you realize what you're missing, and then come back to me. And I think that's a good advice sometimes. I don't think he did that because he returned to London, and he practiced in London, Edinburgh, and Oxford. Now, around this time, this is a sort of contribution to osteopathy to somebody else. There was a man whose father was a vicar in Taunton in Devon, who was a bit free with the ladies, and this caused great embarrassment to his father. And he wondered what to do. So this was Stephen Ward, who some of you may have heard of. I don't know, I think you're all too young to realize that, but I'll tell you a bit about him anyway. Eileen Ward was his mother, sought the advice of her brother, Edward Vigors, who worked in the House of Lords. His friend and colleague from Ireland, Jocelyn Proby, had just graduated from the Kirksville College of Osteopathy and Surgery in Missouri. The two men agreed to meet Stephen to sell him the idea of becoming an osteopath. Proby and Ward immediately liked each other. There is no doubt that Stephen had a very good brain, but no direction, recalls Proby. Edward Vigors and I really hijacked him and sent him off to Kirksville. But we were so confident that he would do well that we agreed to pay his fees. And Stephen did various things in America. There's a lot to read. There's quite a good book called The Affair of State. I'll give you the details if you want, because it is quite gripping reading. And there's one time when he said it was on a hot day in December 1944, and everyone was hoping to catch a glimpse, this is in India, of Mahatma Gandhi, one of the leaders of the Congress Party, recently released from jail, where the British had confined him over his rule in the Quit India movement. Now, Stephen got a hold of a son of a Maharaja. He was very good at getting on with the top people. And he located one of Gandhi's assistants and got him an audience with Gandhi. And the Indian said, "This is Captain Stephen Ward." Gandhi turned to the Englishman, greeted him Indian style, and although it was his day of silence, broke it by saying, "Well, it's a change to have a visit from an English officer who has not come to arrest me." When Gandhi said he suffered from headaches and a stiff neck, Ward revealed that he was an osteopath and offered to try and correct Gandhi's condition. He discovered a lesion in Gandhi's neck and manipulated it. Ward's treatment must have met with some success, because Gandhi agreed to several other meetings, the sum of which left Ward very impressed. Although much of his policy was opposed to that of my own country, Ward said, "I knew that when I was with him, I was in the presence of greatness, and my encounter with him was certainly the most important meeting of my life." It's interesting that this is slightly off the beat, but Jocelyn was involved in getting him to become an osteopath, and he did publicize. And it was a bit like Oscar Wilde himself, Ward. He was a bit of a boy. I mean, I think that the case is true about him, that he would say, if there's any one thing worse than being talked about, is not being talked about. And I think that, so osteopathy was given a bit of a high profile. The taste of high life in Park Lane, he was very well associated with socially. His newly found professional confidence made Ward look around for an opportunity to start again on his own. It came almost immediately. Ward was he was working for the Osteopathic Association clinic in Dorset Square for £8 a week at the time. He was near the association's telephone in the clinic one afternoon when a call came through from the American embassy. Could the clinic recommend a first-class osteopath? Of course, Ward said, thinking quickly. You should go to our best man. His name is Dr. Stephen Ward, and his rooms are at. Ward hesitated, then gave the address of a friend. And, Ward concluded, if you give us a convenient time, we'll be happy to make the appointment for you. The time was arranged, and as Ward described it later, I put down the telephone and rushed around to my friend to ask him if I could borrow his consulting room for an hour. He agreed, and I sat there awaiting my first patient in the West End. The bell rang, and in walked the American ambassador, Averell Harriman. So those of you who are American will know the significance of that. They gave him a tremendous lift up. His real breakthrough probably came when Winston Churchill sought treatment. Ward had his patients Duncan Sands and his wife, Diana, who was Churchill's daughter, and they recommended Ward to Churchill. Ward had some very fascinating stories about visiting Churchill in his bunker during the war and treating him. And I won't go on about that because that can take a while, but quite an interesting medical philosophical point of view, that Churchill's views of some of the specialists who used to come and treat him. He took well to osteopathy. New patients liked the idea of being treated by Churchill's osteopath, and when they found that Ward's expertise matched his reputation, they spread the news. Ward had started with Harriman. Soon he was treating King Peter of Yugoslavia, 6 members of the Churchill family, Ava Gardner, Mary Martin, and Mel Ferrer. Within a year, he decided he had sufficient private patients to set up his own clinic, so he took consulting rooms on the west side of Cavendish Square on the fringe of Harley Street. There's another little note I just came across about a midget who used to come and treat in Russell Square, so that's very pertinent for us here. And this is one other mention of Jocelyn in the book, and then I'll leave Stephen Ward. Ward was so relaxed about who came to his flat that he never ever bothered to lock the front door. Girls he had invited would arrive late at night, let themselves in, and either wake him in the morning with a cup of coffee or leave a note of thanks on the kitchen table. His osteopath friend, Jocelyn Proby, was staying in the flat once when Ward was away and, as Ward had requested, left the front door unlocked. I was woken in the middle of the night by voices in the sitting room, he recalls. I got out of bed to investigate and found myself confronted by the whole chorus line from the Windmill Theatre. Before I could ask the girls what the hell they are doing there, one of them said, "Don't worry, love, Stephen said we can stay if we want to." With that, they all fell asleep on the floor. When I got up in the morning, they had all disappeared. Now, as you know, or some of you may know, that Stephen Ward was involved with two prostitutes called Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies, who were also involved with John Profumo, who was Harold Macmillan's war minister. But the trouble was, she was also having an affair with a Russian diplomat called Ivanov. And this caused a huge crisis and nearly brought the Macmillan government down. This is in the early 60s, and it was a great thing at the time. And so inevitably a trial followed, which a lot of people, whatever they thought of Stephen Ward, felt was badly rigged. And it was described, I'll find this bit in a minute here, it's just, it was considered a bit of a stitch-up, the whole thing. But the Lord Denning, who was the Master of the Rolls eventually, he described him as the most evil man I've ever met, which was very impartial of a senior judge. I'll find this. Here we are, got it. It's just interesting, these two Lords are different. Lord Denning said, "The most evil man I've ever met," and Lord Goodman said this was the historic victim of a historic injustice. So the jury is out on that. You can read the story. But he was an osteopath because of Jocelyn and did give osteopathy a certain profile. Now, Jocelyn, when he came back, he was, I think, one of the founders of the GCRO in the 30s. In the 1940s, he was vice principal of the BSO. 1950s, president of the OAGB, and a founder member of the Institute of Applied Technique, which is now the Institute of Classical Osteopathy. He travelled to and fro from Ireland to Britain in the 50s. He practiced from Ballyrain House, which is a very beautiful Georgian house, which is a dower house to the Earls of Carrisford's main castle. And he also had rooms in Merrion Square in Dublin, where I still practice. And that was part of the house owned by Sir William Wilde, who was a very famous ophthalmologist and the father of the aforementioned Oscar. So sometimes people say, isn't it strange that a Synge is in a Wilde house? Jocelyn was a very benevolent man, and he very often used to have people coming from the country in Ireland from a long way away, and he'd put them up at his own expense in a hotel in the town or a pub in the town, and go down every day in his van and bring them up and treat them, sometimes for next to nothing. Sometimes he even had them, if they were seriously ill, in his own house, and he nursed them day by day. He was a remarkable man. And around this time, sort of late 50s, early 60s, I myself was a very sickly child, and I had been given enormous doses of antibiotics because that was very fashionable at the time of the 50s when they were battling with TB and so on. And I culminated in being very seriously ill and being sent home, having been given up on by my father's first cousin, who was head physician at a big hospital in Dublin and professor of medicine at Trinity College. And our lives changed then because we were introduced to Jocelyn Proby and a homeopath. So at the age of 11, 12, I missed a whole term of school, and Jocelyn used to come over every day in his van and treat me. This was mentioned in his little obituary, which is quoted in one of the books. And so obviously I was deeply impressed by that. This is when I first was introduced to the McKinnon technique, which I can talk to you more about that, which some of you have read about. And eventually I recovered, and off I went to secondary school. Having failed my common entrance to get into the school, my mother, as mothers do, persuaded the headmaster to take me. And I got into the bottom form of the school, where I stayed all through the school and did very badly at school and failed in most things, but did manage to get a few O-levels. All the while, Jocelyn became a very close family friend. His wife, in the meantime, had gone to a home suffering from dementia, which was very sad, because she was a lovely and beautiful person. I think I've got more, actually some pictures by her here, which that's a drawing by her. I've just discovered these a couple of weeks ago, these pictures that she drew herself, and that rather enchanting one. Now that is a picture of Jocelyn drawn by Stephen Ward, of an osteopath by an osteopath. And Jocelyn's son Alan, only about 10 years ago, found that as a scrumpled up bit of paper in a drawer and pulled it out and framed it, and it's just a bit historic there. All the while, Jocelyn was a very close friend, and we did a lot with him during the holidays and so on. He did a lot with my parents. He used to go over regularly for meals, and had constant social contact. In the summer we had tennis and tea parties, and in the winter we used to go to movies. He loved movies. And he used to come armed with wonderful fruit and veg, that he had a lovely walled garden behind his house. He employed a full-time gardener, a cowman, a carpenter handyman, and a housekeeper. But I remember going out with him into the garden when the plums are ready to be picked, and he did what he called shakeopathy. He got the tree and he shook it until all the plums fell off, and that's the way we gathered all the plums, because there were so many. He loved his woods, and if patients arrived, the housekeeper would come out on the front doorstep and ring an enormous handbell, and he would come up from the woods. Now this man was in his late 60s at this stage. I can see him still, shirt rolled up to the sleeves, tie on, old Etonian braces, holding up an ancient pair of corduroy trousers, rather too high above his shoes, like Jacques Tati, and carrying a bow saw. He would walk into the consulting room, put this bow saw down on the table, treat the patient, and then pick up the bow saw and go off down to the woods again. When I left school, I vaguely thought I might like to do osteopathy, but I wasn't qualified to do it, so to cut a long story short, I did various jobs, and then I pushed off to Canada, emigrated to Canada. In the meantime, Jocelyn came under the influence of a man called, this is not really osteopathic, but it's a bit of gossip anyway. He was an American artist who was an expert on Gilbert Stuart, who, as you may know, painted a famous picture of George Washington. He also painted a good picture of Lord Carrisford at the time, and so this is what brought this man, Charles Mount, to meet Jocelyn, because he had a picture by Gilbert Stuart. He also wrote a book about John Singer Sargent, and his style of drawing and painting was very like Sargent. He even signed like Sargent. And that's Jocelyn in about mid to early 60s, I suppose. And that's a more formal oil painting of him. Now, the next person that also had an influence on Jocelyn was Ida Rolfe. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She invented this myofascial, or formalized the myofascial approach. And she had a center in Boulder, Colorado, and she came over to preach her particular conviction in Britain here, and came and he got involved with her and had her to stay in Ireland, and I met her. And he was very influenced by her, and he sat at her feet. This is typical. She wasn't the slightest bit interested in what he had to say, but he learned from her a great deal and took it on board, and all his muscular and soft tissue work was very influenced by her. And I met her. In fact, there's another picture I forgot to bring, a picture of Ida Rolfe and Jocelyn and me bending over a sheep with a bloated abdomen, treating it. It died the next day, but I don't blame osteopathy or Ida Rolfe. Now, this is something which has been an icon of mine for years, and I have it up in all my consulting rooms because I wonder if you can guess why. It's because of the significance of the pelvis, and we'll come to that later. Yes, to cut a long story short, I went off. Anyway, I went to Vancouver, and I bluffed my way into university there, got a BA in 1973, and I came back to Ireland on holidays and wondering what I was going to do. And I had a eureka moment in the middle of the night. I woke up and I said, I want to do osteopathy, and I can do it. And so I rang Jocelyn as late as was civilizedly possible in the morning. I rang him at 7 o'clock to tell him that this is what I wanted to do, and I can still remember his moving response. He was absolutely thrilled. And from that point on, he adopted me as his son, his osteopathic son, certainly. And he then rang the BSO and got me an appointment with the great Audrey Smith. And instead of being in front of a board, I was just in front of Audrey Smith, and I said I had to be seen that day because I was going to Canada the next day. And so she interviewed me, and then she said, you'll be hearing from us. And I said, no, I want to hear from you now because I'm going on the plane to Vancouver tomorrow. So she very graciously said, oh, well, we'll accept you for the following year for the intake in 1974. Jocelyn, rather like Stephen Ward, Jocelyn paid my fees for the first year at the BSO, which is incredibly generous. I saw him practice in the holidays. He even put me to work on patients, starting histories and so on, and would come in due course. And I would rather nervously take a patient in and take their history and start to examine them. And then he'd come in and he'd say, never mind that, let's have a look at you. He wasn't interested in histories at all. So any of you who are students, don't take notice of that because that'll get you into trouble. And I remember particularly one occasion, a huge Iranian footballer came in, and he was complaining of a pain in his knee. And there I was diligently examining his knee. And Jocelyn came in and did something to his pelvis, and the chap walked out symptom-free. Yes, in the meantime, Jocelyn, his wife, died, and he remarried a lady who was then Baroness de Robeck. And he said, at last, I've done the right thing by my family and married a baroness. She's still alive, actually, very, very old and rather sad shape, poor girl. I qualified in '78, cut my feet for 6 months in various English practices, cut my teeth in various practices in England, made my mistakes on the English before I returned to Ireland. At this stage, every 2 weeks or so, Jocelyn was traveling to London, met at Heathrow by car at the request of Marjorie Blackie, who was the Queen's homeopathic physician. And she had been terribly impressed with him and used to fly him over and meet him at Heathrow, and he used to treat patients in her rooms in Thurlow Square. And now he was in his late 70s at this stage. I moved back to Ireland in 1978, and when I moved back, the Probys moved back to England. And in the true spirit, I was helping them dismantle the house and move where they have. And so I started off very well by walking into a patient once with a hammer and a screwdriver in my hand, because that's what I'd just been doing. But I followed his tradition with a saw, put it down, treated them, and then removed myself. The second best thing I ever did in my life osteopathically, that is, was I went back to England and persuaded another osteopath to marry me, and that's Pam. Some of you may have met her. She had been in the year ahead of me at the BSO. Now this is something I didn't even hear about at the time. Jocelyn was so modest. Again, Jason will know about this perhaps, but this was an award presented to Jocelyn in 1984 by Princess Anne, Princess Royal, on behalf of the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine. I don't know how that worked. I think it's because Princess Anne was the patron of the GCRO or the OAGB or something. Anyway, that was a wonderful thing. That is the certificate and the medal that goes with it. And somebody else is going to get that one day. We can talk about that afterwards. That's more or less the story of Jocelyn. He went on practicing in England until he was 90. His wife used to get to the telephone first and say, "Oh no, Mr. Proby's retired," and he thought that nobody else was ringing for him anymore. But he was much loved, and people came from all over the world to get treatment from him, but very often the treatment wouldn't last more than a few minutes before he'd fall asleep. But that was quite acceptable to people, because he did in those 2 minutes what was required. Now, that's more or less the story of Jocelyn. He died just short of his 94th birthday. And he was a great man. I can tell you lots of stories about him. But now, to the more serious side of things, I suppose I'm old enough to be a grumpy old man, and I am distressed at the lowering of morale in the osteopathic profession in this country and at home, of course. From what I read and what I talk to people, at best people are bewildered, and a lot of people don't enjoy what they're doing. They can't wait to retire. They have no sense of. I think this is a huge pity. I hope that's not true of any of you. If it is, I hope I might make a little effort to change that, because I think that we are incredibly privileged to represent this wonderful work that was really formalized by Andrew Stader Still and all those wonderful people otherwise. And I have been incredibly privileged to meet a lot of people. I'll just tell you a little anecdote here. In the front row here is a very, very skilled and dear man called Stuart Korth, which some of you may know. And once, when I was a final year student in the BSO, he was tutoring me, and he said, "Come on, Teran, I have to give a report about you. I better go and watch you treating people." So each patient he came in, he said, "What's wrong, and what are you doing, and why are you doing that?" And he looked puzzled, and I thought I was in trouble. And this went on several. In the end, he said, "Every time I asked you to do something, you did it in the most awkward and unlikely way that I could imagine. But it did work, so I can't fault you." So on my report, he put, "Inelegant but effective." And I've been very proud of that ever since. I think that'll be on my tombstone with Stuart's name on the bottom. Now, the fact remains is that I got going on this because there were figures published in Ireland about this, that a huge number of days are lost through back pain in industry. And if they said in Ireland that 60% of cases are never diagnosed, and I would venture to say that the other 40% were misdiagnosed. On the website about Britain, I found that it said there were 60 million workdays lost through backache every year. 230,000 people are off work each day because of back pain. Now, a lot of this is put down to malingering, and I don't think that's because people don't understand it, so they call it malingering. But supposing half those people were malingerers, like blue flu, the other half have genuine problems, and I know this. Other figures, this is another note here, no one dies of backache, but it gives most of us intimations of mortality. 80% of the world's population are temporarily disabled by back pain sometime during their lives. 1 in 20 of us sufferers become chronic cripples. The economic cost of this suffering is enormous. And then he goes on to say, scientific research into back pain is as sparse as the subject is vast. At the recent meeting of the International Society for the Study of Lumbar Spine Pain in Sweden, the Society's president claimed that among the world's 2 million doctors, there were only 200 who have attempted to evaluate their back pain therapies scientifically. And only 20 have devoted their careers exclusively to the research into back pain. With a permanent pool of 2 billion patients who might benefit from advice or administration, the scope for further research is almost unlimited. And when I looked this up, there was not a mention of osteopaths. There was something like 75,000 chiropractic consultations every year, and not a mention of what has happened. What has happened? I think this is an absolute disgrace, and it's a shame on us. And it's time we got back on the rails and started doing it, because I think this is completely unnecessary. I think there is an answer for most back pain, and this is where I'm going to have my head shot off in a minute. I don't mind, because I really believe we have this tremendous gift and potential in our hands and in our ability, and we need to get it back. Now back to Jocelyn for a moment. Jocelyn said, in one sense, an osteopathic lesion is any structural perversion which produces or maintains functional disorder, and it is not essential that a bone or joint should be involved in it. A lesion, for instance, may be muscular or ligamentous, or in certain circumstances, a viscous or organ may act as a lesion. The typical osteopathic lesion, however, is a bony lesion and involves one or more bones and joints, and the soft tissues connected with them. It is by the bony lesion, and particularly vertebral lesion, that osteopathy as a school of practice must stand or fall. The bony lesion is essentially an acute or chronic joint strain, and it has certain very definite symptoms and clinical signs, some of which are present in all cases. The most important of these are as follows. Now, you can see this in his book. I won't go into this. But I just personally want to, and this is, I know, controversial, but I want to reiterate that this is the uniqueness of osteopathy, which is still rediscovered. Now, bear with me for a second. Here we are. Jocelyn used to quote this piece of scripture in the front of his books, and it was in the authorized King James Version, which I'm sure Andrew Taylor still would have used. Some people don't like anything other than that. There was a story I heard in Canada once that they were talking about various translations of the Bible, and this old boy stood up in his frock coat and he hit the table and he said, "The King James Version is good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me." But this one I have taken from a modern translation. It's out of Ephesians. Under his control, all the different parts of the body fit together. Remember, this is about 2,000 years ago. And the whole body is held together by every joint with which it is provided, so that when each separate part works as it should, the body grows and builds itself up through love. Now, I am absolutely convinced that structure governs function, and our primary responsibility is to make sure these joints in the body are moving. Moving parts are meant to move. We're a bunch of moving parts, and if some of the parts aren't moving, it's going to cause a compensation problem. We've heard a lot of good stuff here today about how osteopathic lesions can predispose to other sorts of sickness in that area, and I really believe in this. This is nothing new. It's old stuff, but it's absolutely true. Now, what gets left out is that every joint is meant to move, and all sorts of people have trauma. Jason was talking about picking up his teenage children and rearranging them every day, which is a very good idea to do to one's children in all sorts of ways, but certainly osteopathically. And I believe in that certainly to be true. We're always getting traumas and falls and things. The body has a great way to adapt and to compensate for that. But it's a compensation, it is an adaptation, and eventually that compensation breaks down. Now, in the middle of all this, the pelvis gets neglected because there's an enormous amount of confusion and bewilderment about the pelvis. So I shall quote from your great John Wernham, which will go down well, I hope. I would like to, this is John Wernham talking, I would like to quote from J.M. Littlejohn's notes on the sacroiliac articulation. The spine is built on the foundation of the pelvis, and all spinal movement depends on it and is regulated by the structural and functional condition of this foundation. Nobody wants to face up to sacroiliac problems. This is still John Wernham. When I was a member of the Back Pain Society 20 years ago, a lecturer rose to his feet with the remark, "I'm not going to talk about the sacroiliac lesion." A titter of amusement rippled through the audience, most of whom were medics, and the whole question of sacroiliac problems was dismissed and buried and forgotten. Some years ago, the many difficulties we appear to encounter in attempting to deal with the pelvic girdle were discussed at great length by members of the faculty of the BSO, only to be abandoned at just one more unsolvable mystery. I can remember a lecturer opening the morning session with the words, "Having said my prayers, I will now proceed to talk about the sacroiliac lesions." The person concerned was the principal of the school in those days. The point I'm making is there's a lot of confusion about sacroiliac joints, and I don't think there need to be. Now I'm going to say something which might shock some people who've invited me here. Jocelyn wrote a little book called The Integrity of the Pelvic Girdle. Now if you want to keep that as an artifact in the archive, I suggest you put it in a safe, lock the safe, and throw away the key. Now I say this with the greatest respect for Jocelyn, because he was a wonderful man in what he did, but he got terribly confused. He's not the only one about what sacroiliacs did, and he had all sorts of explanations about things going up and down. And I'll tell you how I arrived at what I think of it now. I was tipping along in practice, treating what I thought were hypermobile SIs, and I was giving a great business to a sports shop that sold weights belts for divers. And I put these on as sacroiliac belts because they were cheaper than buying proper things, you see. And I was doing a great trade, and I was very popular with this shop. And people's pelvises and SIs were being very unstable. And then I got appendicitis in 1987. And my wife, Pam, who's the brains, she took over my practice. And there was a retired Norwegian diplomat who was coming to me frequently, always going wrong. And she treated him, and she said, "You know, I don't think he's going wrong all the time. I don't think you're getting him right." And then this led us to a long process of discovering what on earth they were doing. And we came to a very simple conclusion that, you know, we all palpate individual apophyseal joints on spines. That's perfectly normal. We all do that. We learned that from the first year. The sacrum is no different. The sacrum is 5 vertebrae fused together. 3 of them are involved in the sacroiliac joint. So when you're saying somebody's supine, you're palpating them with your fingers for their apophyseal joints in their thoracic spine, their lumbar spine. You go on down and you do a segmental analysis of the SI. Now it's all joined together, but it's still, you find that it's caught up at individual points. And it's the same theory. You've just got to make sure all those points. You wouldn't get somebody coming in with all their lumbars wrong. I know that doesn't often happen, but you wouldn't say, "Oh, I'll just treat the top one and the bottom one." You've got to make sure they're all moving. And this is the approach we've taken, and we've worked hard at it, and at the moment, and I haven't found this anywhere else in the literature, the nomenclature of what's going on there, we have found about 9 different points. There is S1, S2, and S3, but there are subdivisions of those, and I can talk to you about these later if you're interested. And you've got 2 sides, and you've got a sacrum, and you've got 2 innominates, and it's like a Rubik's Cube. And you've just got to work away at it until you get it right. And there's another bit by John Wernham here. It's, yes, a little, yes. The person, yes, that's right. It was about the time that Proby and Hall, the two stalwarts. Now, I think I'm right in saying that Jocelyn, along with John Wernham and Hall, were the co-founders of the Institute of Applied Technique, which then became. So there was this time when the Proby and Hall, the two stalwarts of osteopathic scene in those days, exchanged diametrically opposed views on this perennial problem through the postal service, with Mr. Proby espousing the cause of the McKinnon technique, and Mr. Hall defending the American style of Fryatt and Schwab. The results could only be called a total stalemate. And you may be familiar with this, and I've got a lot of this correspondence actually. Little John emphasized to me, this is John Wernham, that the sacroiliac was of profound importance. It was on that premise that I have studied and worked my way through many a lesion complex in this area of the body, and I am completely convinced on two counts. One, that it is not impossible to understand or to resolve, and two, that it is absolutely vital to the success of our treatment. How often have I received patients who have undergone many hours of osteopathic treatment without results? And how often have I seen the overall picture change following pelvic adjustment? And there's one more little bit I'll read here, which I'm not sure who's written by. It could be John Wernham, or I don't know. Anyway, people often complain to me that I appear to believe that every case is a pelvic case, and that I do not seem to pay any attention to other parts of the skeleton. I can only say in reply that such a notion is absurd, but I do find that the pelvic girdle is the Waterloo of so many operators, and that I have seen gigantic struggles going on between patient and osteopath over long periods, but which showed no signs of being resolved until steps were taken to release the pelvic bones. In many cases, only one such treatment was necessary to bring about a change that was unmistakable in its impact and on the condition and progress of patients. However, in the spite of this often repeated and striking effective piece of clinical evidence, the early indoctrination of our students is powerful enough to withstand every kind of proof, and patients still arrive with their pelvic troubles and depart with the condition undiagnosed, untreated, and unrecognized, and I do believe this to be true. So, this really deals with the whole problem of long legs and short legs. You could name many different complicated cases. The great mistake happened, of course, in the 1930s when, with myelograms, presumably the intervertebral disc took over from any joint problems. This has been a huge heresy in the profession. But intervertebral disc problems are secondary. Soft tissue and muscle problems are secondary. The bony lesions are very important, including the pelvis, especially the pelvis, because that's neglected. Typical things that we see all the time: hamstring strains, groin strains, gluteal insufficiency, they call it. Not a ridiculous expression. I'm sorry to be so outspoken, but gluteal insufficiency, nothing wrong with people's gluteal muscles if their mechanics are operating perfectly all right. And so the whole thing makes it much more complicated. I do believe in life, in various fields, that truth is simple. It may take you a lifetime to understand it and find it, but in principle, the truth is not complicated, it's simple. And I just wanted to make that point to you today. There are all sorts of obstetric implications to it. There are, Stuart will probably witness to this in the children's clinic and so on, but in Ireland, certainly there's more and more interference, what they call active management of birth with children. This has had a profound effect on babies and children, and is causing almost irreparable problems. And it's quite completely unnecessary. This is because there's a great deal of money to be made by aiding the production of babies, even if you're not there. An obstetrician in Dublin will make 8,000 to 10,000 euros for a birth, even if he's not there. And you know, there's a bit of a, I wonder if his integrity is to be brought into question as that's there. Because I had a wonderful experience. I have a daughter who produced 2 grandchildren for me, one a year ago and one 3 years ago. They were both born on my dining room carpet, by design, home birth, with my assistance. And on both occasions, the baby got stuck coming down the birth canal. And I treated the pelvis very gently, wasn't throwing around whatever you like, MET, cranial, whatever you like. And the midwives were amazed. They talked about getting an Indian colleague who put a cloth around one side and a cloth, and they tugged them. And my daughter said, "Can you get Dad first?" So a little knock on my door, and I arrived, and I treated her between contractions. And in no time, baby's head dropped, and it was born perfectly naturally with no trouble, no tears, nothing. You see, that's the sort of thing we should all be doing. And this whole thing is going backwards and it's going in reverse. And never mind what might happen to the mother, although I do, this is a terrible thing for children. And we're producing a whole new generation of babies that are damaged. And it's monstrous, really. I don't know how true that is here, but it is happening in Ireland. And that's just a personal note. But the ability of the body to change and adapt for even when things have been wrong is absolutely wonderful. The capacity of the body to recover and to heal is wonderful. And we have that tool, we have that opportunity. There's one case I'll just tell you about. A lady came to me once. She had a knee problem, and I sorted it out for her fairly satisfactorily. Then she decided to come back to me for a bigger overhaul. Now, I don't normally do this, but I saw her every 2 weeks for, it was a bit like the story we were hearing earlier about Andrew Taylor still taking a long time to treat patients. Every 2 weeks, I worked on her pelvis. She'd been wrong for years and years and years. It took me a long, long time to get it functioning properly. Worked down into her lower extremities, up. Eventually I got her pelvis right. Then her lumbars were in trouble. I worked on those. Occasionally we go back down to the pelvis. Eventually we got the pelvis stable, up into her thoracic spine. Then I came across a rib which was absolutely as solid as that table, and I thought I'll never get that working properly. Eventually I got it working, and then she had neck pain. Then she started to get vertigo, and eventually I was stretching right. It took me 3 years. I discharged her after 3 years. And a month later I was invited to her 90th birthday party. Her whole body had unwound and decompensated. And that is the potential of osteopathy. You can do it at any age. It's better to do it younger than age. That is the power of this wonderful gift that we have. And I hope that you will all, if you don't now, that you will all get a glimpse of that, and with each other's help, endeavor to find out how to do that better. I'm learning all the time. Jocelyn retired at 90. I'm 64 now. If I go to 94, 90 or so, I might get the hang of it. I'm learning all the time. That's what's exciting. But I think it's tragic that people don't realize this very, very exciting tool we have. It's absolutely wonderful. It's the biggest thing in my life, apart from my wife, my grandchildren, and other things. But it's really, I think it's an enormous privilege to be involved in this work. It's absolutely thrilling. And I really hope that some of you have that enthusiasm. And if you haven't got it, I hope you get it. And I shall do my best. You come up and tell me that you're not thrilled with osteopathy, and I'll persuade you to be otherwise. Because it's absolutely extraordinary and thrilling, and I thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much. I'll just tell you a story. You know, you can't expect, I mean, I hear colleagues who send their patients to chiropractors. I mean, it's horrific, horrific, because we can do it better. You know, more and more physios and chiropractors talk about sacroiliacs, but they don't know what they're talking about. They don't do them. They talk about them. I mean, I'm being quite honest here. I mean, there's no point beating around the bush. It's nice to be old enough not to bother to beat around the bush, I must say. But anyway, you have to do it. There's a lovely story about this old couple who used to argue all their life. To do the story of the old couple, married couple, who argued. And at a very old age, somebody persuaded them to go to a psychiatrist. And he said, after they were arguing in his consulting room, he said, I'm going to do something I've never done in my life before. And he got up from behind his desk and went down to the old lady and gave her a really long, lingering kiss on the mouth. And he turned around to the husband and he said, that's what she needs 3 times a week. Right, doctor, I'll bring her into you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You have got to do it. Don't send them to anybody else. You've got to find a way of doing this. And there's one other. Yes, I mean, I was going to say, do you want any questions? But it reminds me of a story. Einstein was going around with his chauffeur on a lecture tour. And the chauffeur said, you know, I've been hearing you lecturing for so long. I think I could do it as well as you can. Right, said Einstein, you're on. So they swapped roles one night. And the chauffeur got up and did a pretty good job on the lecture. And then came the question time. And somebody asked a really difficult question about quantum physics. The chauffeur paused for a moment and he said, "This question is so ridiculously easy, I'm going to hand you over to my chauffeur." Are there any questions? Ask my chauffeur.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Teran. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to you all for this memorable and great day we have had together. So I hope you have a good journey back home, and see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thank you.